Hola a todos, bienvenidos a la tercera de nuestras charlas de ComPolCorp. Hoy vamos a viajar al norte del continente para hablar con una experta comprobada en política, Melanie Lawhorn. Ella es estadounidense, Bachelor of Arts, Public Policy and Economic Justice por la Universidad de Carolina del Norte. También es máster en Strategic Public Relations por la George Washington University. A lo largo de su carrera ha sido Research Assistant de Trade and Export Promotion en el Council of State Governments de Estados Unidos, así como parte del staff de las áreas de Financial Disclosure y Advice and Educational del Comité de Ética de la Cámara de Representantes de Estados Unidos. Actualmente se desenvuelve como secretaria de prensa del senador Mike Crapo, miembro del Senado de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica. Hi, Melanie. Welcome to Charlas de ComPolCorp. Thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm well, Andres. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. I'm good. If it's okay with you, let's start right away.
Sounds great.
Okay. As I said in the introduction, you have a long and awesome career in the U.S. public service. You are the press secretary of a member of the United States Senate. Your education is also really great. So I want to ask you at first, how important is in your job to be a professional in politics and to work with people that have studied politics or any other areas around it, like economics or law? How is it like that?
So I don't think you have to study politics or public policy to work in a professional field like mine. Ideally, we are constituents too for the members that we work for. And so our goal is to work on behalf of our fellow constituents to make our country and our communities a better place. We have people in our office who majored in communications. We have people in our office that majored in engineering. So the person that advises the senator on energy and infrastructure issues, she's an engineer based on her education. The senator himself has a law degree. No one else in our office has a law degree, but some offices do have people with law degrees to better understand some of the finer details of how the laws are actually written or the specific lines of how the laws need to change. I do think it's good for people to have diverse backgrounds when working, even in politics, because everybody has their own opinion. You know, in America, we have Democrat and Republican as the two parties that largely run the government. But at the end of the day, a lot of people do have a little bit of opinion in each category. And so having people that share different ideas about how to achieve the same goal sometimes works out for the good of the Senate as a whole.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that you have an engineer in your team for energy. That's a point, that's a thing that we are not we don't usually see. So that's interesting for me.
Yeah, and I should specify, she was a petroleum engineer, so she studied like kind of like the chemical engineering kind of stuff of how energy is developed and created or used across a different variety of forms of energy.
That's awesome. Let's go to the next question. Here in ComPolCorp, we say that there's a big difference between a good and a bad politician. For example, Rafa Rubio, a great Spanish advisor that was our first guest in Charlas de ComPolCorp, he told us that the ideal of political management is like a stool with three legs. In the first one, you have the policies as public policies. In the second, we have politics as the art of public negotiation. And in the third one, we have communications. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this point of view?
I definitely agree with that point of view. I think all three aspects of all three of those aspects are, having all three is what makes a good politician. For instance, like, you have to know what policies are, but you don't know what policies are important without politics, because, for instance, there are Idaho, which is the state for the senator that I work for, is much more rural and agriculture based than, say, New York City. So New York City and those constituents have very different needs than the constituents in Idaho have. And so understanding the politics and what the people need goes into how you decide which policies to implement, which to change, which to improve. And then communications. What's the point of having a policy or doing politics if you can't tell the story? We do have to be able to tell the story. Why did the senator vote a certain way? Why is he pushing a certain policy? And that's what communications does, is the why, and tells the story. I think in other ways, a good or bad politician, it may depend on what you think about their politics. Some people look at a good or bad politician based on politics, but from my view, I wholly agree with the approach that you just mentioned, having all three. I also think a good politician is someone who sticks to their promises and says that as part of their politicking or campaigning, I'm going to do this thing. And I think a good politician is someone who sticks to their promises and pushes to have those policies done. A bad politician, frankly, I think, is someone who just says they're going to do something and never sticks to it, because then they have more politics than they do have policies. And then other aspects is someone who's good with empathy. I think that's a good politician, but also somebody who can't understand what their constituents want or can't understand what their constituent needs, and they're just there for the power. They're not going to understand the policies. So again, it is all tied in to one, and I definitely agree with the stool with three legs approach, that you need policies, politics, and communications, because without politics, you don't understand the regional differences, and without understanding those differences, you can't put together the policies, and none of that matters if you can't communicate and tell the story of what you're doing and why.
You just mentioned about the story. In our company, we defend the notion or the concept of storytelling. This is something new here in Ecuador, but in the US is something that you have had like a long time. How important is the storytelling in your daily job for the senator?
It's very important. So I've been working for my senator for 6 years. And so I have really learned the deep issues that are important to people in Idaho. A lot of that is stuff that deals with the military, or things that deal with agriculture or rural development. If I worked for someone in New York, I might be more focused on bigger policies for bigger companies, or things that were more focused on urban issues. So being able to tell the story that education is needed in rural areas where there's not as much access, or where healthcare is needed for a veteran who has to drive 5 hours to the nearest veterans hospital. Telling that story and why it's important is what keeps the job going, and it appeals to the empathetic senses that I think makes a good politician.
I totally agree with you in what you just said. Now, if it's okay with you, I want to talk about your work. But first, I think that this is very, very important. I need you to explain us how the Congress of the United States works. We have two chambers, the House of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Why? Because here in Ecuador, there was a citizen proposal to change our parliament system from a National Assembly to a Congress with two houses like the one in the US. So in a few words, if that's even possible, what is the US Congress?
In a few words is hard, but I'll just say this: the Senate is better than the House of Representatives. Of course, I think folks on the House would disagree, but the House of Representatives is by nature considered the lower chamber, and the Senate is considered the upper chamber. And so in the House of Representatives, there are 435 representatives who represent the 50 states, and then there are a few extras who represent the territories. But the 435 members that represent the states are elected based on population size. So for instance, Idaho has only 2 members of the House of Representatives, but North Carolina has 14 members in the House of Representatives. It's because there's fewer people in Idaho, and there's more people in North Carolina. But then the Senate, each state gets two senators. And so there's only 100. There's 100 senators, and the way they're divided is the House moves a lot more quickly on legislation. So they'll introduce a bill, vote on it, and pass it all in the same week. In the Senate, it's a much slower process, and it's intended to be slower because it's intended to be more deliberate. Because, if you have all 14 members from North Carolina in the House saying yes to something, but then 2 members in Idaho saying, I don't agree with that, then you take it to the Senate and it's a 2 versus 2 kind of argument. That's just boiling it down to 2 states against one another, but that's kind of how it works as a whole. In the House of Representatives, members are also able to be younger. So the House of Representatives, you can be 25 years old when you run for the House of Representatives, but you have to be 30 before you can run for the Senate. So it's just, the Senate is an older body, and it's just a slower, more deliberate process to considering legislation that comes from the House of Representatives.
Melanie, would you say that it's a good idea to have 2 chambers, or that it depends?
I think for someone like me who has always lived with it, I can certainly see the argument from both sides. I think it's a good idea because I think that, if one is constantly rushing through legislation all the time, then they're not taking the time to slow down and think about how it might actually impact the country as a whole. And in the Senate, we take it a little bit slower so that we can fully assess and understand what the long-term impacts of legislation are. But at times, it might be frustrating if the Senate spends 3 weeks looking at one piece of legislation. Then people really think, well, what are you doing? You're not doing anything. But it's because, we're talking to experts, we're talking to more constituents, we're looking at other research studies or assessing the costs. And there's a lot that goes into passing a piece of legislation that I do appreciate a little bit the slower nature.
Great. Okay, now let's hear about your work at the Senate. I'm interested in knowing how is confirmed your team. Do you have journalists, former journalists, lawyers, economists, engineers? Everyone has everyone has a specific assignment every day. Because what we see here in Ecuador is only like the movies about politics, but the really Hollywood style ones. This is something that we are going to talk later. But we don't see in real life on a daily basis US politics. So what is like? And also, if it's okay, give us your impressions of the new politics, according or like talking about social media, fake news, and everything that.
Well, first of all, I would say working in the Senate is not at all like it is in House of Cards. We don't push people in front of trains if we don't like what they said. So we don't have journalists in our office, and where we are, the media is separate from the government. So they work for newspapers and the internet. But my job as a press secretary is to pitch the media. So I tell the media, hey, it'd be really great if you could talk about this particular bill that my boss is working on. So my day-to-day job is working with journalists, answering their questions. Sometimes they ask questions that I don't know anything about. And so then it gives me an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what another member of Congress might be talking about and trying to see where we fit into that narrative. I have been in the Senate for 6 years, and I have been able to witness and see all of it. I've worked on 3 Supreme Court justices. I've worked on 2 impeachments. And I've worked through a presidential election. I've worked under a Republican president, and I've worked under a Democratic president. I have worked when the Senate was controlled by Democrats and when the Senate was controlled by Republicans. And so it's the way it works in our office is we're divided into, I would say, 4 kind of sections. So one is the legislative section, and that's the staff that works on policies. So the legislative assistants, I think we have 4 of them, they divide their portfolios into different categories. So there's one person that works on agriculture issues and natural resources. There is someone that works on military issues and veterans issues. There's someone that works on healthcare and education. And then there's someone that works on the budget or other items like the post office and things like that. So those are the folks that constantly work on the policies and find out what constituents are asking us to do. And then there's an administrative function in our office. And those are the folks that make sure that we're following all of the rules, we're ordering the right equipment, we're purchasing flags to give to constituents, and then there's a scheduling component. So that's the third component, is scheduling, and that's the person who's responsible for helping the senators schedule meetings or votes or visits with constituents and things like that. And then the last component is my component, it's the communications and press component. And again, like we discussed earlier, my job is to help tell the story, whether that's telling the story we want to tell because we're really proud of a piece of legislation that my boss is working on, or whether we're telling the story about why my boss doesn't support a piece of legislation. That's my job. And the things we do in my job are social media, radio interviews, TV interviews, or just writing op-eds or opinion pieces. I'm not sure what you call them in Ecuador, or just like working with journalists to give them information about what is going on.
And how do you feel about social media and fake news? How do you treat that thing in your daily basis? Because it's really, I really said that now a danger for the profession.
Yeah, and I think it's a double-edged sword, if that phrase makes sense. It's a good and a bad thing, social media. Social media is good in the sense that as the senator can put out his opinion whenever he wants, and he can put out his statements anytime he wants, and that is completely and exactly what he feels or thinks about an issue. Sometimes when we work with journalists, you give them 5 sentences as an explanation, and they only publish 1. So you don't get to see his whole voice. You don't get to understand the whole issue of what he wants to say. And here in the United States, we have the freedom of the press. So a lot of people use the phrase fake news. And I like to say, I don't think any of it is, I won't say this. Most of it is not fake, but a lot of it can be or incomplete. And I think that's a detriment to having an informed public when you're only telling one side of a story. And I think there are some news stations and news sources that only tell one side, and rarely there's only one side to an issue. As for social media as a whole, I think it's causing the people furthest on the right or furthest on the left to have louder voices than are representative in society. I like to think about it this way. If you go to a restaurant and you have a really good experience, you're not really going to go leave a comment on Yelp and say, I had a great experience. It was the best I ever did. More people are more inclined to say, wow, this experience really sucked. And so I think social media oftentimes is an echo chamber for people to express their biggest dissatisfactions. And that tends to pull people further apart than it does bring them together, because then everyone can have a voice. But people in the middle who can see a little bit of both sides rarely share their opinions, because the people on the far ends are so loud about how their opinions are. And with social media, there's an easy way for bad people to take advantage and create fake profiles and try to push lies, what you called fake news, and things that just aren't true.
Yeah, that's the dark side of social media. But I think, or maybe I'm wrong, but I want to ask you, have you ever had any good example of social media? I mean, maybe a citizen that could talk directly to your senator and they solve any local problem or something like that?
So you're asking if like a constituent has said something on social media that inspired the senator to do something differently?
Yeah, that could be an example.
Okay. No, I see it frankly more as a benefit for the senator to be able to share his story or his opinions. I think it's much easier of a communication than sharing it to the senator from constituents, because on social media, it's hard to know who is a constituent of Idaho and who's not. And so if he works on behalf of the people from Idaho, it's hard to know that the person on the other side of the computer screen is from Idaho and is really trying to get him to do what his constituents would want. There have been times where we analyze the reaction and the engagement of a particular social media post just to see what people thought of it as a whole. And those are things at times that influence or encourage the senator to speak up more on an issue, or to maybe rethink his approach to how he's communicating on that issue.
Yeah, really interesting, that point of view. Thank you, Melanie. Now I want to talk about something that happened in January. That was, everybody knows, but it's when a group of former President Trump's supporters invade the Capitol. The images the rest of the world saw were of an absolute chaos, almost extreme violence, and we can say anarchy. What can you tell us about that experience? Because you were working in the Capitol, but maybe you weren't there, or what happened?
Well, because of COVID, I was actually working from home that day, just to be safe. But I remember watching the TV and I was on the phone with my boss when I said, oh, I think they just broke in. It looks like someone just broke into a window. And then I remember for the rest of the afternoon, I felt helpless. And really sad, just sad to see that had happened. I work at the Capitol. I've been working in the Capitol for over 7 years, and I've never seen something like this. Police officers are constantly stopping people from entering the building, but they were outnumbered, and I don't think anyone knew whether people were armed with weapons or not. And so once they realized they were outnumbered, it became a lot harder to hold them off. I think later on, after I got over the sadness and the fear of what happened, I was angry. The Senate floor, the floor of the House of Representatives, and some of the places you guys probably saw pictures of inside are places that even as a staff member, I can't just walk in anytime I want. They're sacred places where we conduct some of the highest work of our government. It's, we think that the United States has such a great record of being diplomatic, and to see it just kind of like beat up and torn to threads was really discouraging. And I actually have some of the police officers are my friends. And so I went back a couple days later just to check on them, and they were sad. They were tired, and none of them had prepared for what happened. So it was a very sad and a very dark day. And to go back to the question we had, I think social media kind of fueled that. I think the angriest of angry people were there, and maybe the people who believed things that weren't necessarily true were some of the people that were there. I mean, you mentioned that it was Trump supporters, but there were also a ton of Trump supporters at home who were also angry and sad about what was happening. That's just not what we're supposed to be. And that's something we typically see maybe from other countries that nobody really wanted to see from the United States. So it was a tough day, but I do hope that we can continue working towards a better future where that doesn't happen again.
I agree with you that it was a really sad day for democracy around the world. And let's hope that never happens again. And we are talking some serious things. I want to ask you something that it's going around my head like years. What is the military, or in specific, what is a soldier for the Americans? Because, for example, here in Ecuador, the military, it's just one part of the state. But I always thought that in the US, a soldier is almost a hero. What do you think about that?
I do think a soldier is a hero. I think any person has been in the armed forces is a hero. Because we have had a democratic government for so long. I think sometimes it's hard to recognize the things that we have as our freedoms here in America. For instance, I traveled to Idaho a couple days ago by myself. In some countries, women can't travel without their husbands or without a father or a brother present. I have a job. In some countries, women can't have a job. I can vote, and I can vote anytime I want. I can vote for a Democrat one day, and I can vote for a Republican the next day. There's a lot of places where you don't even get to vote, or if you do vote, you have to vote for a particular person or a particular party. And there's things like getting to choose my religion, or choose, or even choose to say bad things about the government. And those are freedoms that other people don't have. And so for me, a soldier and all the ones that have fought for many years are people who are fighting to try to give other people those freedoms, or they're fighting to make sure that I get to keep those freedoms. So that's why I look at soldiers and military members as heroes.
Thank you for your answer, Melanie. This is something that is really interesting for me and keeps me thinking about it. Okay, now I want to ask you something that also it's really a good thing to talk about. What is like to live in DC and work in politics in DC? For example, when I was in Brussels, they used to use an expression that was the Brussels bubble, that it means just a few people that work there is the people that have a lot of power and they meet only between them. But what it's like to live in the US and in DC and work in your example, work in the capital?
Yeah, so living in Washington, D.C., in the D.C. area is a lot of fun, but it's also exhausting. So people here always talk politics. They always want to know what you know or who you know, or whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat. When I go home to North Carolina, people don't care. They want to know what you ate for breakfast. They want to know what you think of the weather or things like that. So in living here, I'm constantly turned on and paying attention to the news. DC is its own bubble. We like to call it inside the Beltway, which is an interstate that runs around the DC area. And so we're more focused on what's being voted on or what legislation is going to pass or not pass. People outside of here, sometimes they care, but they don't care, and it's not their full day. It's not everything that they focus on. And so as somebody who lives here, I don't get to see the quiet moments as much, but my senator, he goes home. So the Senate votes typically Monday night through Thursday afternoon, and then on Thursday nights to Monday morning, he's back home in Idaho. And so he gets to go home and he gets to see the quiet times with his family. He's a senator, so sometimes people recognize him in public and ask him questions. But for the most part, DC's always on the go, and everybody's always trying to figure out what they can do better and what's next. There is no time sometimes to just pause and slow down.
That's really interesting. It's like an expression that I heard maybe all the time in DC, it's a New York minute or something like that.
Yeah, it always is.
Okay, finally, as I mentioned before in the talk, I want to ask you about about the final question that we ask all our guests, and it's, please give us a movie, a series, and a book that you strongly recommend.
So a movie that I would recommend is called The Big Short, and it's about kind of how the 2008 economic crisis was started with the housing market, because I think that that's something that started in the United States but ultimately impacted the entire world. I think we're still dealing with things from the economic crisis and trying to figure out how to prevent that from happening again, even after a pandemic. So that's the movie, The Big Short. A series, I really like Scandal. It's not really exactly how life in DC is, but I think it's a good and fun show to watch. I also like Jack Ryan, which kind of looks at the way the US CIA works, our intelligence agency. And a book that I recommend is Love Your Enemies by Arthur Brooks. And it basically talks about how to talk with other people with whom you might disagree. So we live, he says, in a culture of contempt where we think, oh, you're a Trump supporter, so we can't be friends, or oh, you're a Biden supporter, so we can't be friends. And it looks at the ways that we as humans can find common ground, and how we can accept others and talk to others, even if we might disagree.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for this extremely useful talk. Everything you have told us today is very helpful. And
well, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed talking to you and catching up some.
Yeah, we hope to have you with us very soon again.
I would love to. Sounds great.
Thank you. Y así concluimos nuestra tercera charla de ComPolCorp. Muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos han dedicado este tiempo y les invitamos a seguirnos en todas nuestras redes sociales como ComPolCorp y también a visitarnos en nuestra página web www.compolcorp.com. Yo soy Andrés Obando y nos vemos en la próxima charla.